True, you can, and I'm asking you to name some of them.
Okay, you can say Paul.
I'm sorry?
Paul was a pretty good example.
Okay, Paul, okay. I was thinking more in Old Testament. I started with Joseph. You remember, Joseph had a problem with his brothers. And what did his brothers do?
Sold him.
Well, first they threw him in a well, a cistern. And then finally they decided, hey, let's don't kill him. That's what they first thought, let's just kill him. Then they said, no, let's throw him in a cistern and he can just die there. And finally they went back, and some people came by and they sold him to a caravan going to Egypt. And later on, whenever the brothers come to Egypt because of a severe famine in Israel, Joseph is in charge of all of the grain and all of the supplies of Egypt to parcel them out because Egypt also was in a deep famine, but Joseph had prepared the whole country for that famine by buying up the grain and storing it in warehouses. And so at that time, as he revealed himself to his brothers, and they were so embarrassed, guilty for what they had done to their brother. You remember what they said? You remember what Joseph said to them? You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And Joseph went through that test time, but he stayed familiar and faithful to follow God's leadership. And so God taught him how to interpret dreams. That's how he became the commissar, if you will, of all of the grain being produced in Egypt, all of the cattle and everything else. Another example, of course, is Job. Job for sure went through testing, didn't he? And Satan tried to use that testing and said, if you do thus and so, God, he'll just curse you and want to die. And Job did not do that. He questioned God. He tried to get God to talk to him and explain what was going on, but he never questioned God. He never backed off from God. He never refused God. He never cursed God. Remember, even his wife told him, curse God and die. And he said, no, I'll not do that. He's my God. And so Job stood the test. And you can go on through scriptures and see again and again how God permits us to be tested in our own faith. Each one of us as well have faced a test of some sort. And God is not trying to see whether we are sincere or not. He knows that. But he's trying us to help our faith be strengthened. God,
Bill?
yes.
I'm just sitting there thinking, on Noah, I don't know if you'd call it a test or not, but can you imagine God telling him to build a boat?
Yeah, which they didn't know.
People making fun of it.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
25
Yeah,
years.
for sure. Noah was tested, for sure. And did go find all these animals. Put all the stuff in the ark for all these animals, and so on and so on, yes. None of that had ever been done before. And he did it. Yeah, he obeyed God.
Yeah.
Well, Abraham was tested. And so God was testing Abraham. And Abraham says, well, Lord, here I am. And he says, and here's the test. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the Mount Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Now, first of all, God acknowledges that Isaac is Abraham's only son. Ishmael had already left. He was already out. He was a number of years older than Isaac was. And even Isaac, when he lived there, he made fun of, when Ishmael was there, he made fun of Isaac in many different occasions, which we can see in the Old Testament account. But God acknowledges here, Isaac is the son of promise, the promise that I had made to you, Abraham, and this is your only son. do we find any other scripture in the Bible that mimics, that says these same kinds of things? Where else does it say his only son or your only son? How about John 3:16? Yeah, 3:16. Where it says God gave his one and only son, his unique son. So we see in this episode with Abraham a foreshadowing, if you will. At that time, they couldn't recognize that, but now that we're past that time, when Jesus came and died on the cross as the sacrifice for all of our sins, we hear in John 3:16 how God so loved the world that he gave his one and only unique son. And we now see a foreshadowing of what God's going to do in the future through what he did with Abraham. So take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you about. There's so many things that's missing from this episode that we would like to ask, right? What did Abraham think when he heard that? Here is his one and only son, his son born past the age of possibility for he and his wife, his only heir, and now he's told to take that son and sacrifice him. What would have been your thoughts on that? Would you have had some questions rise in your mind?
I'm sure you know what you're going to do.
I don't know if any of you just have one son or not. Yeah. And they are joys to us, right? Just like the daughters are, of course. But still, in that day, the only son would be the heir to take over the life, the work, the material possessions, and all of their father. What about the land of Moriah? Where was Moriah? Well, if we look in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, it is the only other place in the Old Testament where Moriah is mentioned. So what later is unique about the mountain Moriah?
Where the temple was built?
Yes, it is. It is where Solomon built the temple. It was on Mount Moriah, or in Jerusalem. And so Mount Moriah in Jerusalem is a high place, a mountain-like area. And on that place, on Mount Moriah, is where Solomon built the temple that they would worship at, and that God had told them to build. And so the place where Abram was to go and sacrifice his only son, the place that God sent him to, turns out to be the very place that God says, build your temple here. Build your place of worship right here. And then he tells him to offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that he would point out to him. Burnt offering was common. Burnt offering of a child was not uncommon in that day among the pagan religions. We read again and again about how certain the prophets of Baal or the prophets of the Asherah or any of the other gods that were celebrated at that time, how child sacrifice was a part of their worship. I know that gives us the squeamies, for sure. But still, it was not uncommon, although God had never said in his relationship with Abraham anything about child sacrifice. And actually, in the Old Testament, child sacrifice is forbidden. Now that comes a later in time, during the time of Moses, in the writing of Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Let's see if I can find those verses. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, those particular, Leviticus 18:21, 20 verse 3, and then Deuteronomy chapter 12 and chapter 18. It is specifically, exactly forbidden to sacrifice your children as a sacrifice to God. And so, at this time testing, God says you take your only son and offer him up as a burnt offering at this mountain. And so, they set off. Let's look at Genesis chapter 22 verses 3 through 10. Let me ask you some questions first. I did prepare my PowerPoint, it's just not up here, sorry. What do we immediately learn about what was about to unfold that Abraham did not know? When we read verses 1 and 2, what do we learn that Abraham did not know?
That he was going to be asked to sacrifice his son.
Yeah, that he's going to be sacrifice his son. Once again, how did Abraham respond to the call of God?
He obeyed it.
Yeah, he did. We'll see in these next verses how he got up early the next morning. What three imperatives summarize the test God gave to Abraham? What three imperatives?
Well, Mom wrote, and wanted me to share with y'all, God tested Abram not to trip him with his fall, but to deepen his capacity to obey God and to develop his character.
That's exactly right. That's exactly. He wasn't trying to trick Abraham. He was just testing him to help him mature. So, the three imperatives. Take your son. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. That was the three imperatives that Abraham was given. In what ways might this test seem counterintuitive to the promises God had made to Abraham?
Well, he promised him a son, and he
Yes.
was gonna have a great nation, and now he's gonna sacrifice it?
Yeah, that's right. So it sounds counter, what is this going on? You promised me a son and now you're giving me a son? That's one of our questions. And now you're gonna tell me to take him and sacrifice him? What's going on here? Would be a fair question in my mind, but we don't have any record that Abraham thought or asked that question. In other words, we're seeing that Abraham, at least from the record that we have here, God tells him, pick up and go to a land I'll show you, and Abraham does that. And then he tells here, Abraham, take your son, your only son, that I promised to give to you, and sacrifice him. It's each instance upon the command of God, the direction of God, he does what God calls him to do. So some lessons. We will have life experiences that test the depth of our faith. And probably, I could say, we have already all had tests that test our faith. When God calls out to us, we, like Abraham, are to affirm our availability to him. He said, Abraham, and Abraham responds, Lord, here I am. Tell me what you want me to do. Our commitment to the Lord is to exceed our devotion even to those persons and things that are most precious to us. God does ask first place in our lives, even over our wives, our children, our husbands, our family. God asks our devotion to him. Not for bad, not for hurt, but for good. Because our other relationships will fall in place as we give God first place in our relationships. Both God's sovereignty and righteousness are to be affirmed by a people of faith without requiring an explanation or justification on his part as the holy God. We can say, why, God? Why are you doing this to me? Or why are you subjecting me to this? But as we see, Abraham did not question God, either in his calling to go to this land that God was showing him, or to go to Mount Moriah to offer the sacrifice. But when God tells us something, often we say, why, God? Why did you do this to me? Couldn't you have done this to somebody else? Why did you do this to me? We tend to ask that question. And God does not have to answer. Often we see, after the fact, the good that comes out of it for us. So, Genesis chapter 22, verses 3 through 10. Let's read those verses together. Verses 3 through 10. It's a long passage. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked out together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, "My father?" And he replied, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And then the 2 of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told them about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. And then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. That's quite a story. So Isaac speaks, So Abraham, in obedience, immediate obedience to God. God speaks to him. The next morning, Abraham gets up and starts preparing for the journey. He got up early in the morning. He took his donkey, saddled him, chose 2 of the young men that worked for him, and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. Now, look, they lived in a tent, and there's a lot of people around them. And his wife Sarah is there. We have no mention of him saying to Sarah, "Well, I'm going to take our son up and give him, as God says, as a burnt offering." We have no record that he told Sarah these things. He was just going to obey God. I can imagine if he'd have told his wife that there would have been a lot of weeping and wailing, don't you? And probably in Abraham's, well, it's my presupposition that in Abraham's heart, there was also weeping and wailing at this possibility. And so then they set out. Now, they've got to have something to eat, so obviously Sarah and the helpers quickly prepared meals, food for them to take. I don't know if it was beef jerky, sheep jerky, whatever it was that they had to eat. But anyway, they had food to eat. They were traveling for 3 days. And so they set out. And on the 3rd day, now where were they when they left? Probably at Beersheba, which is, let's see, Beersheba is not on this map. It's on down here. And we don't have another map, do we? Beersheba is a little bit, further south than, well, no, here it is, here's Beersheba, here's Hebron. Beersheba, you remember, had settled at the Oaks of Mamre. Can you see? Let me get over on this side. Here's Beersheba. And so here they began, and Jerusalem is up here. The distance from Beersheba to Jerusalem is about 45 miles. So they weren't rushing to get there. It took them 3 days to get there. One commentator says that could be walked probably in 1 day. It would be a long day, but they were used to long days. Walking 2 to 3 miles an hour is what they usually say, but I think in those societies they may have walked faster than that. I don't know. But they were leading a donkey along with the wood on its back, maybe another donkey to carry their food and supplies. Just guesstimating all of this. But they took, on the 3rd day, it says they could see the mountain where God was leading them. And so then Abraham said in verse 5, said to his young men, you stay here with the donkey. They offloaded the wood. Isaac picked it up to carry it. I mean, the man, his dad's 120 years of age. For us, we would say, you know, that's an old person. But remember, he lived to be 175. So I'm sure he was still a strong man, but Isaac was a strapping teenager or a strong young man. And he took the wood on his back. And then Abraham says to the 2 boys that were there, the boy and I, Isaac and I, will go over there to worship. And then, what does he say?
We'll come back.
We'll come back. Not I'll come back, but we'll come back. It sounds like in that he had faith or an idea or an understanding in his own heart of hearts that God was going to provide what needed to be. So Abram took the wood in verse 6 and laid it on his son Isaac, and in his hand he took fire and the knife. This reminds us of back in pioneer days, doesn't it? Somebody was going somewhere else, they often would carry fire in a small vessel. I don't even know, I think probably was a special name for it, I don't know, but that's past my understanding. But there is a saying, carrying coals to, where is it? And it's a statement that was used back in Pennsylvania. It means, why would you be carrying coals over there whenever they already have coals of fire and their fires are already going? But it's like a useless activity, carrying coals to, I don't remember the name of the place.
Newcastle.
That's it, carrying coals to Newcastle. Who said that? Okay? Yes, you did. Carrying coals to Newcastle, that's right. Because everybody in Newcastle already had their fires going. So, but that was not the case, so he was carrying probably coals of fire, or he was carrying flint to strike a fire. But it says here he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Now notice in verse 7. While going, Isaac asked a question. Father, he says, yes, son. Where is the lamb that's going to be sacrificed? And Abram says, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the word provide could be translated, God sees the lamb that he will provide for us. In other words, God knows what our needs are, and he will provide what we need. So Isaac evidently was satisfied with that, and when they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar, arranged the wood, and then bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar of the wood.
Do you think that, Isaac had some questions there?
Yeah, slightly.
I think I would. Okay, if, what's this? You're tying my hands behind my back and you're laying me on top of the wood and binding my feet? Dad? What's going on? But we have no hint of that. And then Abraham reaches out and took the knife to perform the sacrifice. See, there's just so much here, we'll be able to ask Abraham and Isaac about this when we get to heaven. But I'm sure that there'll be a large group of people gathered around them saying, tell us one more time the details of when you got to Mount Moriah to offer this sacrifice. But Abraham was acting in faith. It looked wrong. It looked impossible. And in his mind, surely he kept thinking, this is the son of promise, and now God, you're claiming him? Did you just give him so that I could offer him as a sacrifice to you? Did you just give him to me so that I could kill him? It raises lots of questions in our minds too, doesn't it? But the essentials of what was taking place between Abraham and God are clear here. Abraham was acting in faith with a God that he had seen again and again and again bless him and not let him down, and recognized his needs and performed what Abraham needed, provided that to him. Testing sometimes really does test us. And we can take from Abraham, as we see him in this severe testing, I would call it, time, and take hope from that, take promise from that, take courage from that. It can encourage us and our faith to walk as God calls us, because in it he will have great blessings for us. So, some questions here. Identify the actions in these verses that indicate Abraham intended to carry out the instructions of God. What was he doing? What did we see in those 10 verses or so? What did we see him doing to carry out what God had told him to do?
Well, he got up and he got the donkey and.
He got the donkey, got up early the next morning.
Yeah,
He split the wood.
yeah. Got 2 young men to go with him.
That's right. Okay, what else?
Bound the son on the wood. He
What?
bound the son.
He
on
bound
the
his
wood.
son, yes, he did. He raised the wood for the altar.
Betty wanted to know why he bound him. I said to keep him from getting off of the altar.
Yeah. Imagine. I mean, this was not testing Isaac's faith, though it surely must have.
Yeah, I think it was, I think Isaac showed a lot of faith too,
Yeah.
just like Abraham did.
Yeah,
He trusted his father,
yeah.
just like Jesus trusted his father.
And surely the instructions from God and the carrying out of those instructions as God had given them, and then God providing, that story surely was shared with Isaac and Isaac's son Jacob. That surely was a story. Let me tell you about what God asked me to do, and in faith what I prepared to do, and how God delivered you, Isaac, that you are the son of promise. Surely that had become a story, just like in all of our families, we have stories of what we did in days past, or how we raised our children, or how we came through a tough time. We share those stories at Thanksgiving time, for sure, don't we?
Mhm.
And surely that was a story that Isaac had heard and repeated about him, because it would also increase his faith to trust in a faithful and steadfast God. Okay? What words confirm the tender relationship between Abraham and Isaac? What words? His son says, Dad. Now, I'm paraphrasing. Dad, and his father answers how?
Here I am.
Yes, son, here I am. What do you have? What questions do you have? And he asked Abraham question. Abraham doesn't just say, well, I'm going to go up there and going to cut your throat. He doesn't say that. He says, God will provide. He calls him son. Okay? If Abraham had given up his past in leaving his homeland, Genesis chapter 12, what would be giving up in the sacrifice of Isaac? If God had not provided something and he had killed Isaac, what would he be losing? What would Abraham be losing?
The fact that he was gonna be the father of nations.
That's right. And he would have lost his heir, which was very precious then. And he would have been losing the son of promise. Yes. What words in these verses suggest that Abraham's faith was filled with hope? What does he say to the two boys? We're going
Come
and
back.
We'll be back.
we'll be back. And then to his son's question, he says, God will provide. He didn't know the answers to either one of those, but he was acting in hope, in faith in God. So some lessons here. Faith in God is a serious matter. It is not an easy path. It does test our faith. Faith is the readiness to answer God even when we do not completely understand. When he says, I want you to do this, the response is, we should immediately do it. We can trust God to do what is right. Did God do what was right? Would it have been better if God had permitted Isaac to be sacrificed? No. God does what is right. He doesn't ask us to do what is wrong. He never asks us to sin. If you are tempted to sin, that temptation does not come from God. God tests us, yes, but he doesn't tempt us to sin. That temptation comes from Satan. The tests God brings to us are not mere games, but opportunities for us to prove our devotion to him with no limits. So then the last 4 verses, 11 through 14, let's read that together aloud. As Abraham is preparing to sacrifice his son, then verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he replied, Here I am. He said, Do not lay a hand on the boy, or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that place, The Lord Will Provide. So today it is said, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. So Abraham says, okay, Isaac, get up off of there. God has provided. Just as we said, he would provide. We don't always know the timing of it, but God will provide. So, angel, I think I played it out. I shouted it out, Abraham, Abraham, didn't I? I can imagine the angel from heaven said it. He didn't whisper, Abraham, Abraham. He was getting his attention for sure. With that knife raised, he says, Abraham, Abraham, don't do a thing to that boy. Don't lay a hand on him. And then I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. And Abraham looked up and saw the ram caught in the thicket, and knew that God had provided a lamb for the sacrifice. And so the lamb was placed on the altar and was sacrificed. He and Isaac sacrificed it to the Lord. Well, confidence in times of testing, and we see for sure in Abraham confidence in this time of God's testing. Some questions. How did the Lord honor Abram's faithful obedience? He provided. In what way did the Lord provide for Abraham and Isaac? Well, in many ways, didn't he? He provided Isaac a loving father. He provided Abraham a place in a country, but also the lamb for sacrifice. How does this story anticipate what God would do through his son, Jesus? For it very closely follows, doesn't it? God sending his son, Jesus, as the sacrifice for our sins. He sent his son to die to pay the price for your sins and my sins. And he died as a sacrifice for us. So some lessons. God, who sometimes tests us, always provides for us. God sees and meets the needs of those who trust him. So some application in times of testing. The story of Abraham and Isaac and Moriah prepares us for an event that would take place many centuries later just outside of Jerusalem. What God asked Abraham to do was what God would do in offering up his son at Calvary. The ultimate way God provides for us is through Jesus Christ. In him, by his sacrificial atoning death, God provided the way we can be saved from our sin and reconciled to him. So have you recently gone through a test of your faith? What was the test, and how did you work through it? I'm not asking you to speak out loud about that, but just to reflect. What tests have you gone through, or are you going through right now? And how did you work through it, and how has God provided, or is providing, or you believe he will provide for you? Recall experiences you've had in which the Lord provided for a need you could see no way to meet. And worship him for his graciousness to you in that time. Abraham could recall several times when God asked